favorite parts about building a brewery is actually building out the draft system. Whether it's a keezer, whether it's a tower, just building one out is a good time and a great project. Today I have Josh Steubing and Todd Burns from the Homebrew Happy Hour podcast, and we're going to talk all about draft systems today on Homebrewing DIY. Building recipes and taking good notes are two of the key fundamentals of making great beer. This is one of the first things that you learn when becoming a new brewer. I started taking notes on a sheet from my extract kit and then quickly moved to Brewing Software. I've tried many different types of brewing software, and then I found Brewfather. This is the one piece of software that you need for recipes and very detailed brew day notes, as well as fermentation notes. Brewfather also integrates with some of the topics that we discuss on this show, like the till hydrometer, the ice spindle, and ferment track. You need no other piece of software than Brewfather. One of the best parts of Brewfather is that you can try it for free. All you need to do is head to our website, homebrewingdiy.beer, and click on the Brewfather banner to sign up for free today. Once again, that's homebrewingdiy.beer and sign up for Brewfather today. Keeping a clean brewery is the key to making great beer that doesn't get contaminated. Do you use a glass or plastic carboy for your fermentation? Did you know that getting your carboy clean can be tough, especially removing the crucian ring? Even with traditional carboy cleaning tools, it can take a lot of time and not get your carboy completely clean. Well, today there's a new tool that can easily clean your carboy and do it fast, and that tool is called a scrubber ducky. Scrubber duckies are a new magnetic carboy cleaner that are easy to use and get the cleaning results required in brewing. Drop a magnetic scrubber into your carboy and be able to scrub away all of the grime and that hard to clean crucian. They are no match for scrubber duckies, and you can get yours today at scrubberduckies.com. Once again, head over to scrubberduckies.com. Have you ever wanted to make a podcast? Do you have a subject you want to discuss with listeners? Do you even know where to start? Well, if you want to make a podcast and you want to get started now, I could not recommend Anchor enough. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your phone or computer. Creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. And you can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hey, look, I shopped around for a place to post my podcast, and Anchor was the easiest, most streamlined experience you could ask for. So if you're looking for a place for your new podcast, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Once again, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And welcome back to Homebrewing DIY, the podcast that takes on the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Gadgets, contraptions, and parts. This podcast covers it all. On today's show, we're talking to Joshua Steubing and Todd Burns of the Homebrew Happy Hour podcast. Todd is also the owner of CM Becker and Keg Connection down in Texas, and we're going to go into a deep dive with them about draft systems and things that you can do, tips and tricks for dealing with foam, all the way to some of the best faucets that you can get. So very, very fun episode today, and I'm excited to have them on the show. But first, I'd like to thank all of our patrons over at Patreon. It's your support that keeps this show coming to you for free week after week. If you want to give it any amount over at Patreon, you can head to patreon.com/homebrewing. homebrewing DIY. You can give it any amount, and we still have a special going on. If you give it the $1 level, you'll be able to get your own set of homebrewing DIY stickers, and we'll also get you access to our ad-free RSS feed. We also produce these episodes early for our patrons, and they get a bonus episode every month. So if you really want to get some of those really great features, head over to patreon.com/homebrewing DIY. Another way to support the show is by writing us a review. You can go to podchaser.com, or if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, just scroll to the bottom of your app right now, and right there you can write us a review. Any star value is great. The feedback is really what we want to get, and it really helps improve this show and also helps other homebrewers find this show. Another way to support the show is to head over to ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com, and you can give a one-time contribution. This is a new service that we're trying out, and the idea is that you can buy me a coffee. I actually went in and changed it a bit, and now you are essentially buying me a beer. So if you want to buy me a beer as a way of saying thanks, just head to ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com. The last way that you can support the show is by heading over to our website, homebrewingdiy.beer, and using our sponsor banners. If you purchase a year subscription at Brewfather, or if you go and buy a brew bag from brewinabag.com, you will then support the show. Your prices will always stay the same, but then they know that we sent you. So always a great way of supporting the show. Do the same shopping you would normally do and be able to, throw a little support to the show. We also have our June Brewers Roundtable. It has now been officially announced. If you head to homebrewingdiy.beer and click on the events tab, that will take you to where you can sign up for our Homebrewers Roundtable. It's open to any of our listeners or really anyone who would like to attend. And this month we're talking to Brian Rabe of Low Oxygen Brewing. He's going to give a small, short discussion and then open it up for Q&A to all of our listeners to really have a cool discussion about the low oxygen brewing method. So head over to homebrewingdiy.beer and click on the events tab. I'd like to read some feedback I got from last week's show about grain mills. I got this from Chimichu over on Reddit, and he said to me, "I like your podcast, so please keep the episodes coming." Honestly, though, 10 minutes for an intro to a 30-minute episode is way too much. I know I can skip the intro, but I just want to give you some feedback. And while I do totally agree that 10 minutes is a little excessive, I think last week I just had a lot of announcements to make between feedback and new things that are happening in the homebrewing DIY world. It did take a little bit. So I really do appreciate the feedback, and I will try to be more conscious of how much time the announcements at the beginning of the episode are taking. So that being said, I am going to then pivot right into our episode, but only after I tell you that if you would like to give us feedback, you can always send it to podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer. Head to our website and hit the contact tab, and you can fill out that form and it'll send us an email. Or if you hit me up on social media, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, also on Reddit, but just look for @homebrewingdiy, all one word. So let's jump into today's episode where we're going to talk about draft systems, and we're going to have the crew from the Homebrew Happy Hour podcast. I'd like to welcome my two guests here on the show today. I have Josh Steubing and Todd Burns from the Homebrew Happy Hour podcast. Welcome, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Oh, we're glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm so super happy that you guys are on my show. If any of you do listen to Homebrew Happy Hour, you'll know that a couple weeks ago I was actually on their podcast, and I had a great time being on the show with Josh. And why don't you just start off by maybe telling my listeners about Homebrew Happy Hour and maybe some of the things that you guys cover?
Yeah, absolutely. So Homebrew Happy Hour, we've been doing since 2015 as a Q&A podcast. We had a good, I think it was 14-month of not producing any content after, we did it for like a year and then we stopped doing it. I don't like talking about it really, but when we started back up 3 years ago, we added James Carlson who couldn't be on here, unfortunately, now, but he's the director of operations for CM Becker. Todd, who's the other co-host and on the show right now with us, is the president, and we call him the chief keg washer of Keg Connection, and I do all of the marketing stuff for Todd's brands. But yeah, the show started as just a Q&A for people on like draft systems mainly and kegging stuff. That was our expertise, and we've kind of grown into, interviewing people in the industry, other podcasters like yourself, and taking questions all across the spectrum, because now we have access, fortunately, in-house or our industry friends to take questions on, brewing solutions, on ingredients, building recipes, equipment for fermentation, all of the above. So it's really cool seeing where the show's gone over the last 5 years now that we've been doing it, and kind of, the community we've been able to build from just doing this kind of goofy podcast from our offices,
Exactly. And Todd, I'd like to know a bit more about maybe CM Becker and Keg Connection and how long those have been around.
Sure. So Keg Connection, we started about 13 years ago, approaching 14 years, I believe now, right, Josh?
Yep.
And we've been doing that, and then we've also, CM Becker I purchased about 4 years ago. It's actually been in business in the United States for about 35 years, and it's a kind of parent or sister company in Germany for over 40 years. So we've been building faucets and flow control type faucets and disconnects for the homebrew industry for a very long time.
And Keg Connection is more of a general homebrewing shop. Is that correct?
So, yeah, when we started Keg Connection, it was really, we specialized in kegging and draft beer, and that's pretty much all we did for many years. Actually, a large part of our business now are ingredients, homebrew supplies, and all those types of things. But, our original passion for the draft is still very evident on the site, because we, it's kind of I would say our biggest category, and the category that we put the most focus on. We actually purchased another site about, it's been a little over 2 years, almost 3 years, but it's homebrewsupply.com. And they were very focused, obviously, on the homebrew supplies and that part of it. So now we're doing everything between the two sites. So that's been a lot of fun for me, because my passion's always been the home brewing, and I've done it for many, many years, and still enjoy doing it almost on a weekly basis now.
So let's talk about your guys' homebrew setups. Josh, what are you brewing on, and what does your setup look like right now?
So my house, I brew with my pop. That's my favorite thing about home brewing, has always been the communal side of it, or the community rather side of it. I like, we are about to form, I say about to, we've been talking for the last 5 years basically about starting a homebrew club in South Austin, but one of these days we're going to get to it. But my pop and I brew all grain batches in 10-gallon volume on a cooling, like an igloo cooler type of system. It's, old school, but it's, what works for us, because we're outdoor brewers, which in Texas isn't a super popular thing right now as we're going into summer, and with us too, it's not the best time to be outdoor brewing, but we make it work. We start early if it's going to get hot in the day, but we use a cooler system for the most part, doing all grain batches. I just brought home, talk about cool equipment, I don't know if you've seen the Spike all-in-one. I think they're calling it the Spike Solo. They sent us a prototype, and a buddy of ours who came down, Kenny, he calls himself the Brewer of Seville. We tried to do a brew day when he came to our headquarters on it, and it failed miserably, and the beer got scorched, and it was all just a mess. So my dad and I are gonna either this coming weekend or in sometime in June do a actual test batch on this. So I'm excited, because I've never used an all-in-one that was not like a Grainfather type of system. And I would love to have that become our primary for 10-gallon batches, because then that would mean we could brew inside and it wouldn't matter that it's 105 degrees outside in the middle of the day. We could brew in the comfort of air conditioning, because I am a man of convenience.
I couldn't agree more on the going electric. It's a big goal of mine in the next year is to actually go 100% electric. I'm still a propane burner on a keggle out in the garage. And I'm in Denver, Colorado, not super hot, but still it has to do with things like I want to be able to brew on a whim and just do it in my kitchen at 7:00 at night and not have it be a big deal. And those all-in-one systems really appeal to me for that reason.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Todd, what does your setup look like?
I have a three vessel Herm system. It's 20 gallons, so I get between 15, 17 gallons out of it at a time. I also have a glycol fermenter so that I can keep things cool, carbonated, all that kind of, all the bells and whistles. I tell you, people talk about not liking to brew in the summer, and I'm like, what are they talking about? That's my favorite time to brew. It's too hot outside, right? So I love the system. I've brewed on pretty much every system you can possibly imagine, and this one's my favorite. I do like the cooler system as well. To me, the way that you brew on it is efficient, and to me, it's a very easy system to brew on. But this Herm system is changed me as a brewer. The amount of consistency that I can get out of it, it's just amazing. I almost never have a bad batch of beer anymore. It's every once in a while there might be I didn't do something exactly, or the recipe was one that I wasn't real happy with. But for the most part, as long as you don't make really stupid mistakes, you can brew pretty damn good beer on it. So I actually, since I say really stupid mistakes, I should mention a good example of that. The system does not work good if you forget to put your false bottom in it, and you get all, like 30-something pounds of grain, and pour the water in there. I did that on my second to last brew. So that was a lot of fun, pulling everything out, putting the false bottom in, and putting it back in again. But the beer actually turned out great. So.
Sounds like a hot, scorching mess, but then it's funny how you do those types of things, and then that beer turns out fine, and then you worked on a beer, really honed in the recipe, tried to do everything perfect. I'm doing it for this competition, and it's kind of bleh.
Yep. It was really funny because I'm screaming, why is it sticking? Why does it keep sticking? I can't get it to flow. What's wrong? And then I look over and see my false bottom sitting on the counter, and I'm like, oh, crap. So, you know what? Those things happen, and it's part of brewing. And, yeah, you can recover it and have the best beer you've ever brewed. I've had it happen more than once.
Yeah, I can use an example. I did a batch on a friend who owns a brewery, and he had a small system at his brewery that he was using for test batches. And he called me up and was like, hey, you want to brew on my test system? And I was like, great. And in the process of him letting me use his stuff, I decided to just throw straight hops in there and not whirlpool. And I totally clogged up his plate chiller and ended up having to use ice wands, like from the kitchen, dipped in sanitizer to cool down my wort so I could pitch it, and ended up being one of the best saisons I've ever made. So it's funny how,
awesome.
Those types of things always happen, and that's just part of brewing in general. When it comes to, electric style brewing, like, these Herm systems, do you really, like, when you specifically talked about this is the most consistent beer that you've really been able to make since starting to brew, what do you think it is about an electric style system that allows you to have such good consistency?
Oh, the one thing is just the temperature. I mean, I'm able to keep the temperature so consistent. And one thing I've learned brewing on the system is no matter how many times you calibrate it, no matter how many things you do, you still have to always get out a thermometer and check it. But, you can make adjustments. The adjustments are fairly slow, but but they're also, again, very consistent. So I try to err on the side of if I'm going to have the temperature not perfect in the beginning after I do the strike, that I like it to be maybe a little lower than it should be, and then start to raise it up. Because if you get it too high, there's obvious consequences of that. So that seems to work really well. And then pretty quickly I can get it to, if I'm trying to mash at 152, I can get it to that 152 and keep it there the whole time. And that, to me, the temperature is everything when you're brewing, if what you're looking for is that consistency.
I couldn't agree more. And so, for example, this brewery controller that you have, it has a PID built into it. Is that right?
It does, yes. And you can also, so I should back up a little bit. We have used about 5 different controllers, and we've really been trying to perfect the controller, because eventually we would like to release a system like this, but I've never been fully happy with the controllers. And the very last controller that we got is literally a dial that you turn. And the old one, you could do a lot of steps and these types of things, which you could do with this one. But I found that if you keep it super simple, then you don't have a lot of variables, and you can control things better. But if your temperature, say it's 2 degrees off according to your thermometer versus what your probes say, you just dial it that direction that you need it to go, regardless of what it says, and you get to that temperature right away. So
exactly, and that's something that I personally do all the time. Is I have a thermometer that I know is calibrated. I calibrate it all the time. Do the ice water test, make sure it hits that exact 32 degrees, and then when I go and do my temperatures, and I've been using, for example, my neighbor has a mash and boil system, and I've been going over and borrowing it and using it so I could have an electric system for the last few batches. And I found that there's a lot of variance in the column, right? So for example, if your probe is sitting at the bottom of your column versus the top of your column, you want to get temperatures throughout that entire column, correct?
Right.
We actually, on my system, I have a probe permanently on the top and the bottom.
Yeah.
The temperature reading is very different. So what I always try to shoot for is I take my thermometer and kind of stir right in the middle while I'm taking the temperature, and then I go off of that. I consider that to be my temperature, right or wrong. That's the way I do it. And I do use it. We have a company in the United States called Kessler that we buy real precision thermometers and hydrometers from, and I use I have a calibrated lab thermometer from them, and I use that to calibrate any other thermometer I'm using. So it works really well.
That's awesome. I kind of wish I had access to something like that.
Yeah, it's great. We have them, and they're so accurate already that sometimes they're quite a bit more expensive, and sometimes you feel like you kind of got ripped off because the calibration is, it's like at 152, this thermometer reads 152.2, and you're like, wow. I didn't need it calibrated, but of course I didn't know that, right?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing is that if you don't have a calibrated, and I'll give you an example. I had a meat thermometer once, and this is a cooking analogy, but I had a meat thermometer once that somehow got whacked out of calibration. I didn't check the calibration before I cooked a turkey, and it said this turkey was done. I went and cut into it, and it was pink as hell inside, and I ruined an entire turkey. And it is important to have your thermometer calibrated, more important than people might give it. And it's something that a lot of people don't do, at least with homebrewers that I've brewed with.
Yeah, it's extremely common. Yeah.
Yeah, super common. Let's talk a bit about draft systems, since you guys definitely talk a lot about draft systems. And, this is homebrewing DIY. We talk about people building keezers all the time. We talk about people taking different refrigerators and hacking them into kegging systems. And I know that you guys get a ton of questions when it comes to people building out their own kegging systems. If I were today a brand new homebrewer and I wanted to go from bottling to kegging, what would you say are the essentials that I would need to keg if I wanted to do it, at least to the most beginner level?
Oh, we have kits that are literally in the low $100 range, sometimes even under $100 that will allow you to keg. Now, if you have a keg on there, sometimes people buy our kits without a keg because they have a keg or a friend gives them a keg. But if you have a keg on there, you can still easily stay under the $200 range and have a system that'll work. So you don't. I think the perception is you have to spend a lot of money, but you really don't. And even with a basic system that has maybe a party type faucet, a plastic faucet on it, when you get ready to build a keezer or you get ready to convert a fridge, it's literally you can pop that off, put a shank on there, drill a hole, and now you've got a refrigerator kit. So it's not a difficult thing to do. So basically, what you need to answer the actual question is you need a regulator. You need a CO2 cylinder, you need the lines for both gas, liquid, and then you need whatever end you're going to have to dispense, which will either be a party style faucet, a faucet with a shank that you can go through a hole with, or obviously a beer tower would be the other option.
Yeah, and let's start with the party faucet. I know that I only at this point use party faucets for their intended purpose, and that's if I take beer to go as a party. And obviously people always, I'm sure, and I know that I've listened to your show, and when I have, people ask the question of like, how do I get rid of foam in a party faucet? And I know that foam in a party faucet is something that is really common. What would you say when it comes to like foaming and foaming issues is the number one issue in draft systems to solve that?
So we have a party faucet that's actually a flow control faucet that you still hold in your hand, has a little trigger on it. I'm jokingly or maybe seriously say that it's a $50 solution to a $3 problem. So they're not cheap; they're like $50, but you can put one of those on there and have full flow control, eliminate the foaming altogether. So that's what I do. I'm actually, this is kind of embarrassing, but I'm serving my beer out of a party faucet in my barn right now because Josh and I are building this colossal keezer for Homebrew Con because we're going to do, they've moved Homebrew Con digitally, and we're going to do a presentation this year. And I was like, oh, we'll build a keezer. It'll take a couple of days, and I think we're like on week 2, right, Josh?
Yeah, it's coming along though. It's coming along.
but anyway, the problem with foam, I think the number one issue that people have with a party faucet when you go to a keg party or something is that they're tapping a brand new keg, and when you tap a brand new keg, it tends to foam a little bit in the beginning. But what happens if you watch people is if it starts to foam when they press down on it, they think that if they don't press down on it as hard, that will keep it from foaming as bad. And it has exactly the opposite effect. If you only press down it a little bit, you cause a bunch of turbulence and you get nothing but foam. So the most important thing, if you have one of those, $3 faucets, is push it all the way down as far as it'll go and let it flow that way. Of course, temperature is super important. A lot of people that serve those are serving them on ice, so temperature typically isn't an issue. But if you're not, and you've got warmer beer, anything over 36 to 38 degrees, you're going to get foam with that type of faucet. And then the other solution is to put a longer line on it. So, they recommend a 5-foot line for proper restriction on a direct draw system, 3/16 ID. But, you could put 7 or 10 feet on there if you're having some foaming issues, and that additional restriction will help you as well.
I'd love to talk a bit about restricting and kind of figuring that out for yourself. Let's say, I built a keezer for myself. I built my first keezer back in 2014. I'm now on my second keezer. And luckily for me, when I was building my first keezer, my best friend at the time was a draft tech, and he had all of the tubing and everything in his truck, and it was awesome. We just went and like built out a keezer, right? And he knew how to restrict line, like in his head. It was like, something he did all the time. But I know that there's kind of a mathematical equation that you can figure out how long a line needs to be. What would you say are the factors into figuring that out?
Yeah, there's definitely a mathematical equation for that. And when that comes into effect, typically would be if you're installing a system in a bar and you're going to do a long draw system where you have actually a different kind of line, and you're cooling the line, and then you're dropping down to what they call the choker line, and then you have to compensate for going up, for going down. I mean, there's a lot of complicated figures that are involved in that. In fact, I've taken a draft beer class where we talked about that for 2 days, but really, people have been doing direct draw systems forever, and everybody's already done the calculation on that. And I think it turns out to be like 4.5 feet, but everybody just says 5 feet. The problem you run into, though, is, again, there's variables. So if your keezer is, it has a controller on it, and it's plus or minus 3 degrees, maybe you're opening it up occasionally because you got a 6-pack in there as well, and your temperature gets higher, then you start having foaming problems, or you've got, one or the other. You over-carbonated your beer, or you're using a very highly carbonated beer, because that's the style. And then all those things will affect it. And, the rule of thumb is just add a little more line to compensate for anything that you might run into. That's why a lot of people order their systems with like either a 7, 10, or we even sell them a 15-foot line. I think that's complete overkill. I mean, and your beer is going to pour extremely slow, but I think it's not a bad idea to put 7 to 10 feet on there if you got some issues.
Yeah, I personally do 7 feet on all mine, but the reasoning being is I actually at times try to overcarb my beers a bit if I'm bottling, right? So like, for example, if I'm going to bottle straight from my system, I personally don't have a beer gun. I should totally get one because I bottle enough. But what I do is I overcarb it a bit, and then for a couple days ahead of time, and then I go and I've built this homebrewing DIY. I've totally DIY'd myself a beer gun out of like a racking cane and a picnic tap.
Nice.
And some pretty crazy stuff, but it works really, really well. But one of the things I have to do is I have to overcarbonate my beer a bit so that I don't lose carbonation in the bottling process. I know that a lot of people, when they're asking questions about, hey, I'm now kegging, but I want to do some bottles to go for a competition, or just bring like a 6-pack with me, what are some of the tools that you could get that would help with that process?
Well, the Lickman makes their beer gun. I've tried every counter pressure bottle filler you can imagine, and we sell different ones, but that's the one I use now because it's just so straightforward and simple. And because you're pressuring up the bottle and putting the beer in at the same pressure, you don't lose carbonation, you don't get foam coming out. But the other counter pressure bottle fillers, and you can make one, or use a similar idea that you basically open a valve and let the air in, and you purge the bottle. Of course, you don't oxygenate the beer. And then once you've purged that bottle with CO2, you push the cap down and it seals it, and you bring it up to 10 psi, and then you deliver the beer at the same, whatever carbonation level you're using, and then you deliver the beer at the same pressure. So that works very well.
It does, and it's also something where if you're filling from a keg, you obviously don't have yeast and things like that in the bottom as well, right?
Yep.
Right. Yeah. I mean, hopefully, we all have, but especially in the very, very beginning, that's one thing. If you're going to be bottling beer for a competition or something, you should drink a few beers out of the keg first, because you're almost certainly going to get some sort of settling unless you've clarified your beer for a month in the secondary and we're super careful. You're always going to get some particulates in there. So it's always good to pour a few beers before you start bottling them for the keg.
Yeah, I call those the sludge beers. When I first when I first put it in a keg, I get it carbonated. My first like 3 or 4 pints are the nickname is actually the sludge beer at my house.
I like that. Yeah.
But then it's funny as you get those 3 or 4 pints out, I do tend to find my clear beers. Right now, hazy IPAs are all the rage, but if I were going for a clear beer, I do find them with gelatin, for example. And after that first few, it's crystal clear and it's amazing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. To me, there's something very appealing if you're serving your beer to your homebrewed beer to somebody that may not always drink homebrewed beer. It's always amazing to me when you pour a perfectly clear glass and you hand it to them and they taste it and they always do the same thing. They go, "This is homebrewed beer?" Like it's impossible to make a good homebrewed beer. People are amazed when you have a good tasting beer, but also a very clear beer. I had a group of guys that I go opening weekend of deer season with every year, and somebody else brewed a keg of beer and gave it to us, and it was just every one was cloudy. And when I asked him about it later, he's like, "Yeah, that doesn't really bother me, but it does bother people that aren't used to it,
Exactly. And a good example is like when the hazy IPAs first started hitting, I would say 3 years ago, and I would be listening to homebrewing podcasts such as Homebrew Happy Hour. Just kidding. But the idea is that I would be listening to podcasts and beer commentary and reading it, and they would all be like, "Oh, this orange juice beer, this doesn't look like the way beer should look." And it took a long time for people to really be on board of not having like a crystal clear IPA, because the haze is all the rage now, right?
Oh, that sounds like our podcast. I think you were listening to us.
I was just going to say, my co-hosts sometimes have negative comments concerning hazy beers and some other styles of beer. I don't always share the belief in, but I do have to tell you, Josh, I poured a sour the other day. It came in a 12-pack, some samples, and I poured it in the glass and sat down, and I said, "I don't know why Josh doesn't like these sours. This smells great." I took a sip of it, and it was the most god-awful beer I think I've ever had in my life. So you were there that night.
Well, I have a bit of a story like that. My neighbor across the street, he always works Great American Beer Festival every year because we're here in Denver. And sad that Great American Beer Festival in 2020 is also going to be a remote conference. So it's heartbreaking to me. But he always got an allotment of beer because he worked the festival, and that was kind of one of the ways that they paid them. And he got this case of a sour beer that was probably the worst sour I've ever had in my entire life, and I still have a ton of them that I can't even bring myself to drink, and I can't bring myself to give away. But because it's beer, I can't get myself to pour it out. So
you send a couple to Josh. That'd be great if you could.
Hey man, I'll do an Instagram chug challenge. That sounds great.
So question, Josh, do you not like sour beers? Is that a thing?
You know that I've been accused of that. I don't get it. I don't understand. No, I can't. I've had one sour in my life. It was at Great Notion in Portland. We were there for HomebrewCon. A listener and his girlfriend took us on a tour. Me and Joe, who works for Homebrew Supply and is also on our show frequently, gave us like a tour. They drove us around, and they're like, "Joe loves hazies. Joe loves sours. Joe, you're gonna love this place. Josh, just come along." And they had one that was called like Blueberry Muffin from Great Notion. And I tell you what, I didn't make a weird face when I drank it. Now I'm not gonna go out of my way to buy it, but sours. I'm just happy that there is a niche for people to drink what they like. Like my pop, his favorite beer, whether he admits it today still or not, is Lone Star. I don't know if you ever had Lone Star, guys.
I've been to Texas. I've had a Lone Star.
It's not very good to me. But I always tell him, because sometimes he'll get embarrassed, and I'll say, "Pop, drink what you like. Who cares if people?" There's a reason why Lone Star is still on the shelves. It's not because nobody doesn't drink them and nobody doesn't like them. And so with sours, that's my approach. I'm willing to try them. I just haven't found one that I'm willing to endorse.
I have to say one thing real quick, Josh. That's not true exactly. There was another sour you liked when we toured New Belgium. You at least told them that you liked one of the sours.
Because I'm polite.
Man, New Belgium has really good sours. So if you didn't like those ones,
no, and this was so long ago. It was like right when we launched the podcast. A month later, one of our vendors got us to hook up, and their director of quality assurance or field director of quality or whatever he is, Matt Meadows. You want to talk to a guy about draft? He wrote the book on it, right? Like on draft standards. And he gave us this long tour and did our podcast, or he did our podcast first. And we're like, oh, thank you for your time. He goes, well, I took the day off. Why don't we just hang out? So he gave us like this bad thing tour. We went and got, beer right off the line. And, by the time I had the sour in my hand, I was probably pretty sloshed. So it probably did taste good. I couldn't tell you which one it was. Todd, do you even remember which sour that he...
I don't. I'll tell you what I do remember is that I was so impressed with their sours that I bought a couple of bottles and brought them back. And Michael Korkus is the German guy that I bought C. Becker from. Him and my dad's 85. He's probably, 82 then. I said, man, I brought this bottle back. I paid $20 for it, and I've saved it. I want to have it with the two of you. And I opened it, and so I really like their sours, but the one I bought literally tasted like vomit. I mean, I poured this beer, and they both took a sip, and they were trying to be very polite. I said, guys, you don't have to drink that. And they poured it out so fast that I've never seen either one of them move that fast, or not years.
That is the risk. That's the risk you could take with a sour is, you think that because it's blended and all that kind of stuff, then the next thing you know, the one bottle you bought is vomit.
Yep.
And that room they have in New Belgium, you may have been there if you're in the...
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, a couple times.
The room they have is just absolutely one of the most amazing things I've ever seen with those. Put them in?
They're foodors. That's what they're called, foodors.
Yes.
Yeah. And the thing is it's actually one of the coolest sour breweries I've ever personally been in, because when you look at other sour brewers, they tend to do it like, smaller barrels are how they're barrel aging it, like your standard, like maybe 55 gallon like wine barrel or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I remember they called it the Forest. It was really, really neat. I was impressed.
Yeah, and New Belgium uses the traditional like fooders that you get from they actually ship them in from Belgium, and that's what they use. And it is really an amazing sour brewery, and it's completely separate of their clean beer brewery. Like it's in a completely separate area, and they put a lot of real estate into it for beers that they don't release a lot of. So that's kind of it's kind of a niche thing that you don't see a lot of the sour beers from New Belgium outside of Colorado anyway.
Right.
Yeah. Let's get back into a bit more onto a draft system, because I have a question that I've been dying to ask you guys, and here's why. I personally have never used a flow control tap in my brewing system. I have just, the forward sealing type of tap, which works great. Why would I want a flow control versus just a regular tap?
I'm telling you right now, you don't want to use one, because if you ever use one, you'll spend a lot of money and never go back to another tap. So no matter what's happening with your beer, you can turn that knob and change the restriction and get a beer that pours perfectly. So if you're having some foaming issues, if you're your temperature goes up, you have another good example. You talked about overcarbonating your beer. So if you have a beer that you serve at, say, 18 PSI, the equivalent of 18 PSI, because most people understand PSI better than the other ways they measure that. And a good example of that would be something. Actually, Coors is served around that. I think it's about 16 or 17. But anyway, a Coors Light would be a good example of that. But a better example would be all the Belgian beers. And then you're also serving a stout, and you've got that at the equivalent of like 8 psi. You don't have to have two different lengths of line. You just turn the knob and get it adjusted for that specific beer. So it just makes life a lot easier, and there's always variable. I mean, my kegerator and I have a kegerator and a keezer here right now. I open the door, I'm checking something. I'm always getting the temperatures off a little bit, and I just make that adjustment. So we actually, my understanding is Cornelius invented it and really brought, or at least they're the ones that brought it into Europe. And the Europeans embraced it, and then it was an American company that did all that, and then we never did it here because we were used to doing it the other way. So now we're starting to see a lot of bars and restaurants go to that because it just makes things so much simpler and easier for the person at the bar. So I'm sure we've all been to a bar where they're pouring beer and the person is literally has a glass and they're putting foam in the glass, and then they just tip it over and let the foam come out, and they keep pouring it. So they're pouring like 2 beers to get 1 beer, and with this they can eliminate that, and it saves them a lot of money.
Yeah, and the other question I have is, when I first built out my first keezer, I had that type of faucet that's, I call them the cheap. They're like brass. They stick if you leave them sitting for a long time. You know what I'm talking about? They're the back sealing ones.
They've made that faucet for over 100 years now.
Yeah, exactly. So that faucet was my first mistake of kegging. I no longer do that. But my question is when you talk about higher quality faucets, you talk about going stainless steel and forward sealing. What are some of the advantages of having stainless steel versus brass and having it be forward sealing versus back sealing?
Well, stainless steel is it's such a durable product, but it's also, you don't have the issues with, possible lead contamination, the chrome lining coming off. Some of these things that people worry a lot about now. It's kind of funny. A good example would be a faucet in your house. All the faucets now are NSF rated, and they don't have any brass that has lead in them, and they're very, very careful about it. Well, most people, like you're in Denver, you're probably getting your water through pipes that have lead welds in them underground, right? Because they've been there for 75 years, right? So, but with the draft beer system, your own plumbing in and do the whole thing. So at the end, everything else is everything we sell is going to be food grade NSF rated lines and clamps and everything else. So at the end, why not put something on there that is going to be not only sanitary but not have any contaminants in it. So that's the reason for stainless. As far as forward seal, you nailed it earlier when you said sticking faucets. If you have an old style faucet, when you close that faucet, you're basically closing beer up inside the faucet, and it's going to be warm, and it is going to stick within probably a day or so if you're in any sort of a warm environment. Whereas with forward seal, it's a little confusing to people because you think forward seal means it seals in the front, so why wouldn't there be beer trapped that way? It's because when you rear seal it, you've got a chamber that you're trapping it in. Whereas with forward seal, you're literally trapping it at the very, very front, and you're not trapping any beer in there permanently. So
exactly. One last question I have is geared around technology and kegging systems. There's a lot of obviously kegging systems out there that are new right now, where it's like trying to get how much beer is left in your keg kind of information, right? I know that the old way of doing that was using flow control sensors. And I know at a homebrew level, there's new products like the Play-Doh keg where you can just use the weight of your keg. Have you guys used any systems like that? And what are your thoughts on them?
You know, I have an old, I've used it once and it didn't work that great, a floating ball that's magnetized and it have a little magnet on the side of the keg that just plunk right to it. So as it goes down, it shows you just a level of what's left in your keg. And obviously you sanitize it before you throw it in there. But that is as much as I was willing to invest at the time into knowing. I love the idea of the plate, like the weight one. I think, what's his name on Instagram? His name's George, but I think East Mill Brewing is what he goes by. Real popular Instagram thing.
Yeah, East Mill Creek Brewing. I love George. He's a good dude.
He's such a good dude. And I believe he started using that Play-Doh, that weight sensor, didn't he? And it just looks phenomenal because it's a precision technology to know, like, you're not guessing, right? You're not guessing. Now, don't get me wrong, the magnet on the side of the keg, I probably wasn't guessing, but it presented issues. I had an off flavor at one point and early on, and I blamed it on it. So it was my scapegoat. I was like, I didn't sanitize that magnet ball good enough. That's why this beer sucked. Not anything I did. But no, me personally, I haven't. And I would love to hear what Todd has to say, because Todd in technology is like peanut butter and insert something terrible.
I am pretty good at technology. Thank you, Josh. My technology on this is I take my hand and pick the keg up and feel how much it weighs. So I do it fairly frequently with my kegerator. And the other way I know it's empty is when it goes and shoots foam out. I've never used anything, and I'm guilty of that. I probably should try some different products, and I'm open to that. But I usually just pick them up and feel how heavy they are. That's how I know where the level is.
I got to be honest, it's what I do too. But every time I see that ring out there that people are setting their kegs on, I'm like, ugh. But you know what I actually want to use it for is not my keg. My CO2 tank is what I want to use it for.
Oh, no kidding, right?
Yeah, because the gauges on the CO2 tank are never right. And is everybody going to be in agreement on that?
Yeah. The problem with CO2 is it's a liquid.
Yep.
So they're right, but they're only reading PSI. They're not reading weight or volume. So your high pressure gauge starts to go down, then that means you're out of CO2. It means you only have air left or CO2 left, and you don't have it, but it's not in liquid form. It's so that means that you're pretty much out of CO2 except for that 800 that you're working from. The other thing too is when you put your CO2 in your kegerator, it's going to read 400 and something PSI, and when you put it in your garage in Texas, it's going to read 1200 PSI until the pressure relief valve blows out, right? So,
yeah, I actually have mine outside my keezer and have it. I drilled a sealed hole for my tubing to go in because I didn't want my tank inside. Plus, I have a 20-pound tank; it doesn't fit my kegerator very well. But that's always been my thing with them is like you never really know how much gas you have until it's like right at the end, because once that gauge actually does start to drop, like you said, that you're right at the end. You've got when I worked in a bar and a restaurant, I knew I had hours left if I could see it actually move, because
you're right, if that long. I mean,
yeah,
my system for that is pretty simple too. I always have an extra CO2 cylinder because you just have no control over it. So
exactly, always have a backup. It's specifically if you're in a commercial setting. For me, it's I have a 20-pound tank. It takes me years to get through it, and then when I do get through it, I just go down and get it filled that day. But that's it's usually not mission critical.
It takes me years to get through mine too. I'm going to say that.
Yeah. So let's highly recommend right now that everybody gets 20-pound tanks, because then you only have to fill them every few years.
That's right. Yeah.
they're nice. They if you can fit them in the system and everything. It's funny though. We sold 20-pound tanks for several years, and they just did not sell. I mean, everybody tends to buy 5 pound. I guess it's because maybe they're putting it in their fridge, or we sell 5s and 10s, but we just couldn't sell 20s. I think if you're going to use a 20, you're probably better off getting it from the gas company anyway, and just doing an exchange, because it stays in hydro and everything. So that's probably might be a better way to do it.
Yeah, and that is the case. Actually, when I get mine done, I have to get it filled, and then so when I go to my local homebrew shop and get it filled, they have to fill it. They can't swap it, right? Because they don't swap 20s.
Yeah.
And luckily, my guy does fill. But then the funny thing is that with the 20-pound tank, I'm actually to where it's about to go out of date, and then I'm going to have to swap it or get it recertified anyway. So.
Yeah, so what I would do is go to an actual gas company.
Yep.
And swap it with them, and they should still swap it if it's in date, even if it's close.
Yeah, they'll totally swap it. And even then, if you go to that same gas company, they could at least certify it for you, right?
Yep.
Sometimes, some of them, a lot of gas company, it's so specialized. A lot of them have to send it off, but they could probably send it off for you. You know who does certify a lot are the people that check fire extinguishers. That's always a good place to look at too.
I've never thought about that, and definitely there's a pro tip for everybody here listening to the podcast. Call your fire extinguisher company if you need to get a tank certified. And just for those that don't know, tanks like propane tanks and CO2 tanks do have a certain lifespan, and they want to make sure that they get certified to make sure that they're not damaged. Because, if a CO2 tank, because it is pressurized gas, were to have an issue, it could technically explode and, do some pretty good damage if you were standing next to it.
It'll get bad pretty quick.
Yeah.
I was in San Antonio one time at a place that did a lot of hydro for us at one time, and they had a cylinder that was made basically from a bomb from World War I. And I asked them, what's the oldest cylinder you've ever certified? And they're like, well, that one right there it was converted over to a CO2 cylinder in 1919, and we're still testing it.
Yeah, those cylinders are tough. I mean, but that's why you have, like, for example, when you get to a 20-pound tank, I think even a 10-pound tank has to have a collar so that if it falls over, you don't break off the cap and it sprays and turns into a rocket.
It is so dangerous, and people don't take it seriously enough. So people have been hurt and killed from dropping a CO2 tank and having it shoot around the room and seriously injure them or kill them. You really should have a chain around it, and any larger tank, you should definitely have a guard on it.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. And a chain is also a great idea. You don't want them falling over. They're just, they're pressurized gas, guys.
It's a missile. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I want to thank, I want to thank Todd. I want to thank Josh for coming on my show today. I really had a great conversation with you all about homebrewing and kegging systems and everything you guys are doing down there. If I wanted to find Homebrew Happy Hour, where would I find it?
You can go to homebrewhappyhour.com. Sorry, that's my radio voice. Homebrewhappyhour.com is our main website, because we also, in the last 18 months, we kind of relaunched our site, and we have a ton of actual content on some of the topics that we cover on the show, or some topics we haven't covered on the show yet. And we produce a lot of videos and put it there. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/homebrew happy hour. And we're on all social media as Homebrew Happy Hour. And our podcast can be found anywhere you download podcasts. So whatever you like to use. I've noticed lately that, it's been Apple for the longest time, but Spotify has really picked up. It's crazy how many people are using Spotify now to consume podcasts. I never would have thought. Maybe thank Joe Rogan for that, or I don't know if that's just been a trend and I haven't been paying attention. But
no, Spotify is really invested in podcasting. It's kind of crazy what's going on over there. They
good for them.
Yeah, good for them. And I also think that it's something where they also own Anchor, so they're where I am actually hosting this podcast and also a sponsor of this show. So the idea is that, Anchor is also owned by Spotify, which is into podcast hosting, which I think is now the biggest podcast host out there. I think more are on Anchor than any other one.
I believe it. I've heard Anchor's great. Yeah, I forgot they were owned by Spotify.
Yeah,
Look at them. Spotify's just taking over.
They're making a play. They're making a play into podcasting. Well, we're running up on time, so I want to thank you guys for coming to the show, and love to have you back some other time. And thank you for being on Homebrewing DIY.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We really enjoyed it.
I want to thank Josh and Todd for coming on the show. It was a really great conversation, and always love talking about draft systems and all the things going on over at the Homebrew Happy Hour. Make sure you head over to homebrewhappyhour.com and check out their podcast. It's a really fun and cool show, and like you said, it's a Q&A show. You learn something new every week because people are asking questions. Well, that's it for this week, and we'll talk next week on Homebrewing DIY.